In my mind's eye, I see myself meeting Fouad for lunch one last time. The place is the Bistro Chat Noir, a taste of Montmartre, that's what the website claims, on East 66th Street in Manhattan. His choice, quiet, and therefore a perfect place to chat, although Fouad will apologize that the food is unadventurous. The subject of our discussion, his obituaries. It would be just the sort of talk that Fouad would relish. Why did the New York Times run a hit piece quoting an old hit piece in The Nation? And this would be a cue for Fouad to share his experiences as a contributor to the Times, how Edward Said used the paper, but how Fouad used it too. Each obit would be an opening to a story, a bit of gossip, an analysis of style versus substance, and examples of how obits had served their writers no less than the departed, sometimes more so. This talk made easy by a shared bottle would be an ideal afternoon. Fouad would then pick up the check, as he always did, and we would embrace for one last time. At the end of May, I planned to pass through New York, and I wrote to Fouad, might we get together? His reply, Michelle, being a New Englander, believes Maine is the promised land. She is indeed mystified that our two tribes have missed this altogether. We shall be in Maine for an extended period of time. My response, there will be next time, and I asked if he'd be interested in doing a pleasant chore together. His reply, he couldn't, and he couldn't explain, but in time you will fully understand and forgive. I didn't connect the dots, testament to Fouad's agility in never allowing illness to push aside the conversation of life, even toward the end. My subject, Fouad's discovery of Israel, would appear to be a footnote to his rich and very varied life as a scholar and as a public intellectual. Fouad's specialty was the Arabs. He didn't write much about Israel per se or claim any unique insights into its complexities. And yet, at a certain point in his life, he decided he would discover Israel for himself, not only by reading and meeting Israelis abroad, but by visiting the place. As it happened, I witnessed several of the stages of this discovery, first as a student and later as his friend. Let me mark those stages and then offer some observations on the crucial insight that I believe Fouad derived from his quest. At night, a searchlight from the Jewish village of Metula could be seen from the high ridge on which my village lay. The searchlight was from the town of the Jews, my grandfather said. In the open, barren country near the border, that land could be seen and the chatter of its people heard across the barbed wire. Fouad wrote this passage in the dream palace of the Arabs. His native village, Arnoun, in South Lebanon, stands less than 5 miles from Metula, the northernmost point in Israel. The story of Fouad's discovery of Israel surely begins with this searchlight, beaming and beckoning across an impenetrable border. But the actual discovery began only much later, after Fouad passed through Beirut and came to America. Exactly 40 years ago, in the fall of 1974, I was a Princeton senior in Fouad Ajami's class, Politics 320, Modernization in the Middle East and North Africa. I was 20, with 2 years of study in Israel under my belt, and Fouad was 29 and recently arrived as an assistant professor of politics. Richard Falk, who played some role in bringing him to Princeton, remembers Fouad as someone who, quote, shared a critical outlook on the follies of the American imperial role and felt a deep sympathy for the Palestinian struggles for their place in the sun, end of quote. And Falk goes on to say that he introduced Fouad to Edward Said, with whom there was a rapid bonding. Now, although my faith in Richard Falk's word on anything is low, I imagine this to be true, but still I have no personal recollection from the fall of 1974 of Fouad as a firebrand. In that class, there was an Israeli freshman, a 24-year-old artillery captain who distinguished himself in the 1973 war, and who was the first Israeli officer to go abroad on undergraduate study leave. He later rose to the rank of brigadier general. I can't be absolutely certain, but I think he may have been the first Israeli whom Fouad ever encountered. And as it happened, this Israeli came right out of central casting. He was a confident soldier scholar, native-born, but a graduate of Phillips Exeter. My vague recollection is that Fouad was fascinated, and the class often turned into a back and forth between the two. When this Israeli was profiled in the Alumni Weekly, he said of Fouad that, quote, "We get along well, relationships at Princeton are very intellectual." That same semester, by the way, some of my Jewish classmates decided to invite Fouad to dinner at the kosher dining facility on campus. I'm sure that it was his earliest kosher culinary experience, the first of many to come, and quite possibly the worst. After I graduated and spent a year in New York, I returned to Princeton as a grad student in 1976. Fouad was still there, but I don't recall him from that time. He'd become a star lecturer with a huge international politics course enrolling more than 300 students. In those years, I think he still wore his Palestinian sympathies on his sleeve. Many of you will have seen a YouTube clip from 1978 of an exchange between Ben Nitai, an economic consultant today known as Benjamin Netanyahu, and a young Fouad in a jet black beard. In this encounter, Fouad is very much the angry Arab, peppering young Bibi with aggressive questions about Israel's policies towards the Palestinians. I went back to the Daily Princetonian, and an issue from April 1979 reported a rumor under this page one headline: "Politics professor informs precept of PLO invitation to visit Lebanon." A student is quoted there as saying that Ajami said jokingly the reason he had received the invitation was because he had spoken out for the PLO in the past, and they hoped he would do so again. That Fouad would have thought to visit Beirut, where he himself grew to manhood, on an invitation from the PLO speaks of another time and of another Fouad. It's usual to say of Fouad that he broke with the Palestinians over the PLO's abuse of the Shiites of Lebanon, especially in the lead up to Israel's 1982 invasion. The shift was probably expedited by his move to SAIS and his engagements with the New Republic, especially Marty Peretz and Leon, and later the publisher Mort Zuckerman. Among American Jews, Fouad found the kind of freewheeling, serious intellectual camaraderie that the Arab American community, then and perhaps now, simply couldn't sustain. Israel wouldn't have drawn Fouad into this world, but there he would have been challenged to test his secondhand notions of Israel against the reality. And so he did test them. From the mid-1980s, Fouad began to pay fairly regular visits to Israel. Because I'd been his student and we could pick one another out in a crowd, I was tasked with meeting him when he landed at Ben Gurion Airport. He was an American citizen, but he was born in an enemy country, and we wanted to spare him any indignity or delay at the airport. So I would greet Fouad before he entered passport control. We would then take a seat while border officers scrutinized his papers. Once he'd been cleared, we would claim his bags, and I'd drive him to his hotel. And by the end of this ritual, we'd be caught up on one another's news, and I'd know what he was hoping to do on his trip. These visits were personal, and he usually made them alone. Fouad didn't participate in conferences, deliver lectures, meet journalists, or give interviews. He did want to meet public figures. My colleague Itamar Rabinovich arranged most of these meetings. I have a very clear memory of Itamar hosting a Sabbath lunch in his apartment so that Fouad could meet Yitzhak Rabin, then out of government, and I'm sure Itamar made many more introductions. On another occasion, I went through a former student to set up a meeting for him with Prime Minister Netanyahu. This would have been in the mid-1990s. I never heard Fouad boast of these meetings, and of course, we would never spread word of them. Fouad wasn't collecting trophies. He wanted to learn what made the country's leaders tick. But he valued his meetings with intellectuals just as highly. He had an especially deep affinity for Meron Ben-Venisti, whose almost tragic complexity fascinated him. On weekends, he was sometimes free. I remember Fouad coming to my home for a Sabbath lunch and a walk we took at a nearby moshav, which is a farming village, and he loved that. The rustic houses, the idling tractors, the scent of the freshly turned earth, the dogs lazing in the road reminded him very powerfully of his native village, and he shared some stories of a distant childhood. We entered a military cemetery on the way back, and I read him some of the tombstones explaining how each war came to have its official name. He was thoughtfully silent. Back in America, Fouad generally steered clear of appearances before the bevy of organizations that support Israel. He'd made an exception in 1992 when he allowed friends to draft him, that was his word, to speak at a New York fundraiser for the Jerusalem Foundation alongside Dan Rather and Henry Kissinger. The Arabic press was all over it, and friends of Fouad learned not to ask this sort of favor from him again. Yet when the American Friends of Tel Aviv University did a gala dinner at the Pierre in honor of Bernard Lewis 2 years ago, Fouad spoke there with humor and wit and emotion. For Bernard, Fouad would do anything, and that's another large topic. But he also nodded toward Tel Aviv University, and it's a statement very much worth having in these days of academic boycott resolutions by bigoted people whose knowledge of Israel and Israeli academe is as nothing compared to Fouad's. Fouad also welcomed publication of his books in Hebrew, and 4 appeared, although in a very curious order. First, The Vanished Imam, rushed to translation in 1988 when Israel was facing a Shiite insurgency in South Lebanon, then The Dream Palace of the Arabs. Only after that, The Arab Predicament, a full 20 years after original publication, and finally, The Syrian Rebellion. Now, what did Fouad take away from his forays of discovery? Much of what's said about Fouad and Israel misses the point, a failure exemplified by the absurd claim made in that hit job in The Nation that Fouad became an ardent Zionist and even underwent a Likudnik conversion. Far from it. Fouad was one of those, and I would include among them another mentor, the late Eli Kaduri, who began as naysayers but reconciled themselves to Israel because it had become, in Kaduri's words, a going concern. Or, as Fouad put it, the state that had fought its way into the world in 1948 is there to stay. Fouad wasn't an ardent Zionist, and I assure you, I know us when I see us. He was a hard-bitten realist who believed that the dreamy denial of Israel's permanence was crippling the Arabs. Fouad accused Arab elites, and especially Arab intellectuals, of failing in their most critical responsibility, to grasp the power of Zionism and later Israel, and so pursue an urgent accommodation with the new reality. Instead, they'd done the opposite, feeding Palestinian refugees and Arab publics with the cruel illusion that history could be undone. Fouad returned over and over to the phrases, history's verdict and harsh truths. It would have been the humane thing, he wrote, to tell the refugees that huge historical verdicts are never overturned, but it was safer to offer a steady diet of evasion and escapism. And this, ever since the Palestinians had taken to the road after 1948, that population had never been given the gift of political truth. Zionism had built a whole new world west of the Jordan River, but Palestinian nationalism had insisted that all this could be undone. And this, Arafat refrained from telling the Palestinians the harsh truths they needed to hear about the urgency of practicality and compromise. He peddled the dream that history's verdict could be overturned, that the right of return was theirs. In short, Arab rejection of Israel had been predicated either on willful ignorance or a lie. Fouad taught himself more about Israel than any Arab intellectual of his generation. He knew its flaws and faults, but he also understood its virtues and strengths. On a barren, small piece of land, he wrote, the Zionists built a durable state. It was military but not militaristic. It took in waves of refugees and refashioned them into citizens. It had room for faith but remained a secular enterprise. Under conditions of a long siege, it maintained a deep and abiding democratic ethos. The Arabs could have learned from this experiment, but they drew back in horror. The Arabs could have learned from this experiment. In that sentence, Fouad suggested the ultimate purpose of his quest. It wasn't to ingratiate himself with the American Jewish establishment, as his critics charged. It was to break down the wall the Arabs thought they had erected around Israel, but that in truth they had erected around themselves. By a circuitous route, Fouad traced that beam of light he first glimpsed shining across the night sky from the far northern edge of Israel back to its very source. Yes, he told truths about the Arabs to America, but perhaps his greater legacy will prove to be the truths he told about Israel to the Arabs. In time, he wrote in his last message to me, you will fully understand and forgive. In time, I believe the Arabs will do the same.